My mother, Eleanor Carter, just passed away. A stroke took her from me, leaving an irreparable pain. Just a few days after my mother's funeral in Evanston, Illinois, my wife, Sophia Bennett, walked into the living room and said something that left me stunned. "Nathan, we're going to split your mother's $2 million inheritance with my dad." I was shocked, my heart pounding. Split it evenly? My mother's inheritance? Before I could respond, George grabbed the stack of inheritance documents on the table, papers I had just received from the lawyer, William Hayes, and hadn't yet put away. He flipped through them, his eyes gleaming, then turned to me. "Nathan, don't be too greedy. Oh, I can finally retire. Gotta thank that stingy old lady." Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Stingy old lady, my mother. My blood rushed to my head. My hands clenched until they trembled. I, Nathan Carter, 38, a pharmacist living in Chicago, sat frozen in our small apartment in Lincoln Park. The apartment my mother had gifted us on the day I married Sophia, trying to swallow the words George had just spat out. My mother, Eleanor Carter, wasn't like that. She was a doctor who, alongside my father, Henry Carter, built the Carter Wellness Clinic in Evanston. Her entire life was dedicated to caring for patients, regardless of fame or money. To me, she was always a devoted, unconditionally loving mother, a strong, forgiving woman, even sacrificing herself for her family. And yet, George, my father-in-law, dared to casually call her a stingy old lady. I turned to Sophia, hoping she'd object, defend my mother. But she just nodded, as if it were obvious. "Yeah, your mom was really tight with money. But now, we get to enjoy it." "You mean my mom, Sophia?" She ignored my shock, turning to George, excitedly discussing, "Dad, we should buy a new car first. Oh, and go shopping on the Magnificent Mile." George nodded, laughing loudly. "A fancy car, designer stuff, everything. This money will change our lives." I stood there, feeling like I'd been stabbed in the back. They didn't just want to take my mother's inheritance. They insulted her, the person I loved most. 8 years of marriage to Sophia. I'd always been patient, always tried to keep the peace. But now, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I wanted to scream, to kick them out, but I held back. If I exploded, they'd know I didn't agree, and I wasn't ready to confront them. I needed time to plan. I took a deep breath, forcing a strained smile. "Fine," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Use the money as you and Dad want." Sophia smiled, satisfied, and George patted my shoulder. "Good job, Nathan. You're a real son-in-law." They continued planning, their voices full of excitement. Sophia talked about a new SUV. George dreamed of a luxurious vacation. I stood there, watching them, but in my heart, I swore they wouldn't touch a cent of my mother's money. That same afternoon, I got a call from the lawyer, William Hayes. He asked to meet at his office in downtown Chicago to discuss the inheritance details. When I arrived, William, with his silver hair and steady voice, explained that my mother left $2 million, including cash and shares in the clinic. "You're the sole heir, Nathan," he said. "This is your mother's personal estate." I nodded, but my mind was in turmoil. The $2 million wasn't just money. It was my mother's final wish, her love for me. I felt a heavy pressure, not because of the amount, but because of Sophia and George's greed. Back at the apartment, I sat on the couch, staring out the window. The Chicago wind blew through, carrying the biting cold of winter. I remembered my mother's funeral, the Evanston church filled with white flowers, the organ's haunting echo. Sophia only stayed briefly before leaving for a client meeting. George didn't even bother to stay, claiming he had important business. I tried to ignore it, but now, after their words, I couldn't forgive them. They didn't respect my mother, didn't respect me. I knew I couldn't let Sophia and George get their way. They thought I'd obediently hand over the money, but they were wrong. I would protect my mother's legacy, everything she left behind. I set the photo down, my heart pounding. After Sophia and George left the living room, still laughing about their lavish plans with my mother's inheritance, I sat alone on the couch, my heart heavy. The Lincoln Park apartment, once a place I thought would be filled with happiness, now felt only lonely. I picked up my mother's photo, Eleanor Carter, from the table, her eyes seeming to ask, "Nathan, are you truly happy?" That question took me back to the past, to the days I met Sophia, to my father's death, and to how everything began. I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, in a family of doctors. My mother, Eleanor, and my father, Henry Carter, ran the Carter Wellness Clinic, a well-known place in Chicago's suburbs. As an only child, I was loved immensely. My mother taught me about honesty, while my father took me fishing, sharing stories of patients he'd saved. I once dreamed of becoming a doctor like them, but I chose pharmacy to forge my own path. My parents were slightly disappointed, but they always supported me. "Nathan, as long as you're happy," my mother once said, smiling gently. Everything changed when my father died in a car accident. I still remember that day, in my college dorm in Chicago, getting a call from my mother. Her voice trembled. "Nathan, your father. He didn't make it." I rushed to Evanston, but when I arrived, my father was already in the morgue, his face peaceful as if asleep. My mother and I clung to each other, crying, the pain tearing my heart apart. My father was a strong man, always laughing heartily, and now he was gone, leaving my mother and me adrift. For months after, I lived like a shadow, working and studying to forget the pain. It was during that dark time that I met Sophia. She was a friend of an acquaintance, appearing at a charity event in downtown Chicago. Sophia, with her golden hair and radiant smile, was like a ray of light in my gloomy life. She worked in marketing for a retail company, vibrant and charming. We talked, and when I shared about my father, she listened, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Nathan, you're stronger than you think." Those words touched me, making me feel less alone. We started dating, and Sophia became my anchor. She visited my home in Evanston, sat with my mother, listened to her stories about my father. I thought I'd found the woman of my destiny. 2 years later, I proposed to Sophia in a small restaurant in Wicker Park. She nodded, her eyes teary. "Yes, Nathan, I will." I brought her to meet my mother, and my mother hugged Sophia, saying, "Thank you for being there for Nathan. Take care of him." Sophia smiled, nodding. I stood there overflowing with happiness, thinking my life was finally complete. But then I had to face her father, George Bennett. We went to George's house in Rogers Park to announce the engagement. George, a divorced man with slicked back hair and an outdated suit, sized me up. He smirked, saying to Sophia, "Marriage. This is your choice? An ordinary pharmacist? Don't you deserve someone more impressive?" I stood there feeling slapped. Sophia laughed awkwardly, pulling my arm. "Dad, Nathan works for a big pharmaceutical company. His family owns the Carter Wellness Clinic in Evanston. Very well known." At that, George's eyes lit up. He changed his attitude instantly, patting my shoulder. "Well, why didn't you say so? A clinic, doctor? That's different. Welcome, Nathan." I was stunned by the shift. I wanted George to judge me by my character, by my love for Sophia, but he only cared about money and status. Sophia laughed, as if it were normal, but I felt unease creeping in. Still, I brushed it off, thinking George was just an outsider, and my love for Sophia would overcome everything. After the wedding, my mother gifted us the Lincoln Park apartment, a generous gift that moved me deeply. "This is your home," she said, hugging me. "Live happily, Nathan." I held Sophia's hand, promising my mother, "I will, Mom." We moved in, and I imagined a life filled with laughter. But from the start, I noticed Sophia wasn't used to housework. She left dishes piled up, clothes scattered, and when I asked, she laughed. "You're better at it, Nathan." "I'm so busy." I sighed, telling myself it was minor, and started doing everything, cooking, cleaning, laundry, to keep the peace. Sophia wasn't just neglectful of chores. She was heavily influenced by her father, George Bennett. George, a failed businessman living in Rogers Park, frequently visited our home, always with the excuse of checking on his daughter. But every time, he found a way to ask for money. The first time, just months after the wedding, George complained about business debts and asked to borrow a few $1,000s. I agreed, thinking it was right to help my father-in-law. Sophia smiled, saying, "Thank you, Nathan. Dad really needs this." But the requests didn't stop. George started asking for money regularly, sometimes for new investments, other times for essentials. I began to feel like his ATM. One event that truly disappointed me happened on Father's Day a few years ago. I wanted to do something special for George, hoping to improve our relationship. I picked out a high-quality leather wallet from a store on the Magnificent Mile, wrapped it carefully, and brought it to his place in Rogers Park. When I gave it to him, George opened it, smirked and said, "This, cheap stuff, Nathan? I only use big brands, don't you know?" I was stunned, trying to explain the wallet's quality, but he cut me off. "Forget it, just give cash next time. It's easier." I looked to Sophia, hoping she'd say something, but she just laughed. "Dad's right, honey. He likes fancy stuff. Just give money next time." I stood there, feeling slapped again. I'd spent time choosing the gift, thinking George would appreciate it, but he only cared about its value. Worse, Sophia didn't defend me. She sided with her father. On the drive back to Lincoln Park, I was silent, my heart full of disappointment. I wondered if Sophia truly saw me as her husband, or just someone to meet her and her father's needs. George's demands didn't stop there. By the third year of marriage, he visited more often, sometimes staying for a week. Each time, he found reasons to ask for money. "Nathan, I need $5,000 to fix my car," he'd say casually. "Or lend me $10,000. I'm about to land a big deal." I started refusing, but Sophia always intervened. "Honey, it's just helping Dad. We have money. What's the big deal?" I looked at her, wanting to say it wasn't about helping, but about feeding George's spending habits. But I stayed silent. I didn't want to argue, didn't want to disrupt our family's harmony. I also tried discussing housework with Sophia. One evening, after washing a pile of dishes she'd left, I said, "Sophia, can you help with cleaning? I'm tired after work too." She looked at me, shrugged. "Nathan, you're better at it. I'm slow, just let you do it. It's faster." I sighed, feeling dismissed. George, who happened to be there, chimed in. "A man's gotta pamper his wife. Nathan, you doing chores is right." I looked at him, wanting to argue, but just nodded. I didn't want to fight both of them. 8 years passed, and I became the one doing everything, cooking, cleaning, and meeting George's financial demands. I was exhausted but kept enduring, thinking it was how to preserve our marriage. I remembered the early days with Sophia, when she comforted me after my father's death, and told myself she was still the woman I loved. But now, after what happened with my mother's inheritance, I began to doubt. Sitting quietly in the apartment, I stared at my mother's photo on the table. She was still smiling in the frame, her eyes gentle and forgiving, as if watching over me. "Mom, I was wrong," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Wrong for tolerating too much. It's time I speak up. Time I protect you. Protect what you left behind. Not just the estate, but your honor, the legacy of a life lived kindly." I'd stayed silent, pretended to agree as they discussed splitting the inheritance, as George and even Sophia saw my mother's legacy as a massive windfall. But in my heart, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. My mother's funeral was the turning point. That day, at a small church in Evanston, where she'd spent her life as a doctor, the sky was gray and cold, the atmosphere heavy. The church was filled with white flowers. The organ's mournful sound echoed through the space. I stood by my mother's casket, my heart breaking into pieces. Many came to pay their respects. Friends, colleagues from Carter Wellness, former patients. They gripped my hand, sharing stories of my mother with red eyes. Nights she stayed up by patients' beds. Times she treated the poor for free. The warm words she left behind. I just nodded, forced a smile, tried to hold back tears, but inside was a storm. I only wished my mother could come back, just once, to tell me as she did when I was a child, "Nathan, everything will be okay." But this time I had to make things okay. For her. Sophia and her father, George Bennett, came too, but their presence only weighed me down more. Sophia, in an expensive black dress, stood by me briefly, whispering, "You okay, Nathan?" I nodded, but she didn't stay long. She left mid-ceremony, claiming a client meeting. George was worse. He breezed through, shook a few hands, then vanished with an excuse of urgent business. I watched them go, feeling they were only there to check a box, not to honor my mother. My father, Henry Carter, died 10 years ago, and now my mother was gone too. I longed for someone to truly share my pain, but Sophia and George clearly weren't those people. In a quiet moment before the casket, I remembered my mother once saying, "Nathan, you have to live for your own happiness. Don't endure what isn't worth it." Those words felt like a reminder, but I didn't yet know how to escape the trap of this marriage. 8 years I'd tolerated Sophia, tolerated George, but now, with my mother gone, I felt I had to change. A few days after the funeral, I got a call from the lawyer, William Hayes. He asked to meet at his downtown Chicago office to discuss the inheritance. I went, still in a daze, and William explained that my mother left $2 million, including cash and clinic share. "You're the sole heir, Nathan," he said, handing me a stack of documents. "This is your mother's personal estate." I nodded, my emotions a mix of gratitude and pressure. The $2 million wasn't just money. It was my mother's wish, her love for me. I tucked the documents into my bag, deciding to read them later. Back at the Lincoln Park apartment, I placed the documents on the table, planning to rest. But I was too exhausted. Grief over my mother and tension with Sophia sent me drifting off on the couch. When I woke, I heard laughter from the living room. Sophia and George, I muttered, surprised. When had they arrived? I stepped out, and the sight before me made my blood boil. Sophia and George were sitting by the table, holding my mother's inheritance documents, flipping through them as if they owned them. Nathan, you did great. George laughed loudly, holding up a paper. A $2 million inheritance. Fantastic. I was stunned, unable to believe they dared touch the documents without asking. Don't touch those, I said, my voice shaking with anger. But Sophia ignored me, smiling. Oh, Nathan, don't be so greedy. This money's enough for us to live comfortably forever. I couldn't let them know my intentions. Not yet. I forced a strained smile, saying, fine, do what you two want. Sophia smiled, satisfied, and George patted my shoulder. Good job, Nathan. We'll transfer the money to the joint account soon. They kept planning, their voices excited. Sophia talked about buying a new condo on the Magnificent Mile. George dreamed of a sports car. I stood there, watching, but in my heart, I swore they wouldn't touch my mother's inheritance. Sophia and George started acting as if the $2 million was already theirs. They spent recklessly from our joint account, as if it were an endless well. Every morning, they left the Lincoln Park apartment with beaming smiles, returning late with bags of designer goods from Magnificent Mile stores. Handbags, shoes, watches, all high-end brands. Sophia showed off a new bag, saying, Nathan, look, isn't it gorgeous? Only $3,000. I stared at her, incredulous. $3,000? From our joint account? But when I asked, she scoffed. Oh, Nathan, with $2 million coming, a few thousand is nothing. George was worse. He practically moved in, treating the apartment like his own. Every day, he lounged on the couch, watching TV, leaving beer cans and food scraps everywhere. I, like a maid, cleaned up after them. I cooked dinner, washed dishes, did laundry, while Sophia and George discussed their lavish plans. One evening, George declared, I'm buying a sports car. With $2 million, I want a convertible. Sophia nodded, excited. Awesome, Dad. I want a new condo in downtown Chicago. I stood there, washing their pile of dishes, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Things got worse when Sophia decided to quit her job. One day, she came home from her marketing firm, tossed her bag on the couch, and said, Nathan, I quit my job. With $2 million, I don't need to work anymore. I was stunned, unable to believe my ear. You quit? I asked, my voice trembling. She shrugged, laughing. Yeah, what's the big deal? Your mom's inheritance is enough for us to live forever. Isn't it? The situation to live forever. Isn't it? I looked at her, wanting to yell that it wasn't her money, but I held back. I still needed to maintain the facade, needed them to think I agreed with their plans. Once they threw a lavish party at the apartment, inviting George's friends, people I didn't even know. They drank expensive wine, laughed loudly, and left a mess for me to clean. When the party ended, Sophia patted my shoulder. Nathan, clean up for me, okay? You're so good at it. George laughed. Yeah, you're the perfect husband. I stood there, holding a trash bag, feeling humiliated. I tried talking to Sophia about the spending. One evening, after cleaning the messy kitchen, I sat with her. Sophia, we can't keep draining the account like this. It's almost empty. She looked at me, smirking. Nathan, why worry? The $2 million is coming. A few tens of thousands is nothing. George, lounging on the couch, chimed in. You're too cautious, Nathan. Live a little. I looked at them, anger rising, but I stayed silent. I couldn't let them know I was in touch with William Hayes. Couldn't let them suspect my plan. Every day, I felt trapped. I worked at the pharmaceutical company, came home to clean, and listened to Sophia and George plan how to spend my mother's inheritance. They weren't just taking my money. They were taking my self-respect. I missed my mother. Her words. Live for your happiness, Nathan. But where was my happiness? Sitting alone in the bedroom, I looked at my mother's photo on the table. Mom, what do? I whispered. I'd contacted William Hayes, and he confirmed the inheritance was separate property, not divisible in a divorce. That was the first ray of hope. Things became unbearable when Sophia and George announced they were going to Hawaii. One evening, after I cleaned up from another lavish party they threw, Sophia walked into the kitchen, phone in hand, beaming. Nathan, Dad and I booked tickets to Hawaii next week. A week of relaxation, Awesome, right? I was stunned, unable to believe my ears. Hawaii? I asked, my voice trembling. Yeah, we need a break before the $2 million comes. George chimed in, laughing. You stay home and handle work, Nathan. Someone's gotta earn money. They laughed, as if it were a joke, but I felt slapped. They didn't invite me, didn't even consider me. I was just the one left to clean up, while they spent money, and dreamed of my mother's inheritance. I nodded, forcing a strained smile. Sounds fun, enjoy. But in my heart, I knew this was my chance. With Sophia and George gone, I could act without suspicion. I'd already contacted William Hayes, after our meeting in downtown Chicago. He confirmed the $2 million inheritance was my mother's separate property, not divisible in a divorce. That was my first hope. And now, I'd make it reality. I would take back control of my life, starting with this apartment. As soon as Sophia and George left to prepare for their trip, I got to work. First, I called a locksmith to the Lincoln Park apartment. As the locksmith changed the locks, I stood there, my heart pounding. Each click of the lock felt like a declaration. I was no longer the tolerant Nathan. I held the new keys, feeling both liberated and anxious. This was the first step, but I knew it would lead to an inevitable confrontation. Next, I checked the joint account. Only $40,000 remained, down from $100,000. Sophia and George had withdrawn over $60,000 for handbags, restaurants, and George's investment plans. I couldn't let them take more. I went to the bank, transferring the entire $40,000 to my personal account. The teller asked, "Are you sure, Mr. Carter?" I nodded, my voice firm. Absolutely. When the transaction was complete, I felt relief. It was money Sophia and I had saved together, but I wouldn't let them squander more. I also contacted William Hayes, again to prepare divorce papers. He sent me a draft via email, and I spent the night reading every line. Divorce. The word made me tremble. 8 years of marriage. I'd tried to be a good husband, but Sophia and George had pushed me to this. To strengthen my resolve, I called Daniel Walsh, my best friend and a lawyer in Chicago. I met Daniel at a small cafe in Wicker Park, pouring out everything from how Sophia and George insulted my mother, to their reckless spending and excluding me from the Hawaii trip. Daniel listened, then placed a hand on my shoulder. "Nathan, you deserve happiness. You're doing the right thing. I'll help with the divorce if you need." His words gave me strength. I wasn't alone in this fight. When Sophia and George boarded their flight to Hawaii, I stood in the apartment, looking at the new locks and keys in my hand. I felt a strange liberation, as if I'd broken the chains of 8 years, but I was also anxious. When they returned and found they couldn't get in, they'd be furious. I knew I'd have to face them, but I was ready. When Sophia and George returned, I got a text from Sophia. "Nathan, we're back. Open the door." I stood by the intercom screen, seeing them outside, wearing Hawaiian print shirts, carrying bags. Sophia knocked. George scowled. I took a deep breath, speaking through the intercom, my voice cold. I changed the locks. "Meet me at the cafe in Wicker Park." Sophia screamed. "What? Change the locks? What game are you playing, Nathan?" George pounded the door, growling. "Open the door now. Who do you think you are?" I turned off the intercom, my heart pounding, but resolute. They no longer controlled me. At the Wicker Park Cafe, I sat in a corner, the divorce papers in my bag. Sophia and George stormed in, faces red, with anger. Sophia rushed to the table, yelling, "Nathan, what's this about? How dare you change the locks? Give me the new keys now." George stood behind, pointing at me. "You think you're smart? Open the house now, or you'll regret it." I looked at them, strangely calm. Sophia was stunned, her eyes wide. "Divorce? Are you serious, Nathan?" George jumped in, panicked. "You're crazy. Why take it this far?" I looked straight at them, my voice firm. "I've had enough. You insulted my mother, called her a stingy old lady, spent our money recklessly, and thought you could take the $2 million inheritance. I won't let that happen." Sophia scoffed, her voice mocking. "Don't be selfish, Nathan. That money's ours, right? We're married." I shook my head, pulling out my phone, opening a website about Illinois inheritance laws. "You're wrong," I said, pointing at the screen. "My mother's inheritance is separate property, not divisible in a divorce. I checked with William Hayes. You won't get a cent." Sophia and George stared at the screen, their faces paling. George stammered, "No way. That money we spent because we thought." Sophia cut in, her voice trembling. "Nathan, you can't do this. What about the joint account? There's still $40,000. I looked into her eyes. I transferred the $40,000 to my personal account as part of the asset division. That's all you're getting. Sophia screamed. What? You took our money? George lunged forward, pointing in my face. You'll regret this, Nathan. I'll sue you. I stayed calm, my voice icy. Go ahead. But you should take responsibility for your actions. I'm done with you. Sophia switched to pleading, her eyes teary. Nathan, please don't divorce. I have no job, no savings. How will I live? George softened too. Think it over, Nathan. We're family. I looked at them, unmoved. Family? They never treated me like family. They only wanted my mother's money, wanted to use me. I slid the divorce papers toward Sophia. Sign, or we go to court. Sophia trembled, and George slumped into a chair, his face pale. The divorce was finalized quickly. With help from William Hayes and my friend Daniel Walsh, I completed the process in weeks. Sophia and George left the Lincoln Park apartment, taking nothing but the designer bags they'd bought. I stood in the empty apartment, feeling liberation mixed with loneliness. I closed the door of the Lincoln Park apartment in Chicago behind me, my heart light as if I'd shed a heavy suit of armor. But with that freedom came a vast emptiness spreading in my chest. The divorce papers were signed. The final chapter of 8 years of marriage, filled with tolerance, endurance, and pain, was officially closed. My mother's $2 million inheritance, Eleanor Carter's legacy, remained intact. Sophia and her father, George, were gone, along with the ambitions they'd tried to impose on me like an invisible debt. The cold Chicago wind swept through the window, carrying the bone-chilling frost of a late autumn afternoon. I stood there, looking at the nearly empty room after moving out most of the furniture. Where do I go now? Where do I start? Sophia and George were now just names in an old chapter I didn't want to revisit. I heard they'd moved to a small apartment in Englewood, a less-than-safe Chicago neighborhood, a far cry from the dreams they once had. The lavish lifestyle, glamorous parties, designer bags, and luxury watches they'd boasted about had become burdens, sold off to pay mounting debts. Their Hawaii trip last year, paid for with our joint credit card, left a massive bill neither could afford. Sophia, who'd refused to work to live slowly, now worked part-time at a low-end clothing store. George, the man who'd worn suits to meet clients like a successful businessman, now drove a delivery truck to get by. I didn't gloat. I didn't rejoice in their struggles, but I no longer pitied them. They chose their path, squandered what little decency they had left when they called my mother a stingy old lady, when they schemed to take what she left behind with a lifetime of dedication. I decided to leave the Lincoln Park apartment, the place that was once a home when we were newlyweds, but later became a cage of arguments, coldness, and sleepless nights, with no common ground. I sold it, not for the money, but because I needed a fresh start. With the proceeds, I bought a new apartment in Lakeview, where my mother lived before moving to a nursing home. It was a small, cozy space, not luxurious, but every corner carried her presence. The pale green armchair where she used to read, the wool blanket still draped over the bed, and the family photo in the living room, where the three of us laughed during a long-ago spring. I continued my job as a pharmacist at a small pharmacy nearby, but this time, I didn't live to save or endure. I lived to truly feel. I used part of my mother's inheritance to start a small fund, supporting underprivileged children in Evanston, just as she'd quietly done for years, without needing thanks. Outside of work, I signed up for an evening photography class, something I dreamed of doing but never dared. Every weekend, I took my camera to the lakeside park in Lakeview, capturing simple moments, golden sunlight on Lake Michigan, falling leaves in the breeze, a stranger's fleeting smile. It was how I healed, bit by bit, and how I rediscovered myself after years of being swept into a life that wasn't mine. Sitting in my new apartment, the late daylight gently illuminating my mother's photo, I felt a deep longing but also peace. My mother didn't just leave me money. She left a spiritual legacy, kindness, integrity, and self-respect. Live for your happiness, Nathan, she'd told me on an ordinary day. Now I truly understood and lived by it. I picked up my phone, calling Daniel Walsh, my close friend who'd stood by me through the worst months, guiding me through the divorce. Coffee? I asked. My treat. We met at a small cafe in Wicker Park. Just coffee, some casual stories, but at one point we laughed until tears streamed over an old memory. And in that moment I realized I was no longer alone, no longer lost. I was starting to live, a real life, for myself. Nathan Carter's story reflects many real aspects of life in the U.S. today, especially issues of finances, family relationships, and self-respect in a society that values individualism and personal responsibility. In the story, Nathan faces the greed of his wife, Sophia, and father-in-law, George, as they try to seize his mother's $2 million inheritance in Chicago. Their selfishness, from reckless spending on the Magnificent Mile to insulting Nathan's mother as a stingy old lady, highlights the financial pressures in consumerist culture in America, where many are tempted by a lavish lifestyle without considering the consequences. Nathan, initially tolerant to keep the peace, represents Americans who live for family duty but lose their voice. His act of changing the locks on the Lincoln Park apartment, transferring the joint account money, and divorcing Sophia marks a personal turning point, reflecting the American values of independence and self-protection. In life, you must prioritize your self-worth and personal happiness, especially when facing those who exploit your kindness. Nathan learned this through the pain of losing his mother and Sophia's betrayal. In today's America, where financial pressures from debt like Sophia and George in Englewood and overspending are common, you need to say no to unreasonable demands, as Nathan did by refusing to share the inheritance. Sopherness. Isa meberturgemarch soferneth self. Redmenawerturgemarch self. Learn to set boundaries, as he did during the confrontation at the Wicker Park Cafe, and find joy in simple things, like Nathan's photography in Lakeview. Finally, cherish true family values, like Nathan honoring his mothers through charity in Evanston, instead of chasing materialism like Sophia and George. Living true to yourself will help you find lasting happiness in this competitive society. Subscribe to the channel to follow Nathan's journey of protecting his self-respect and happiness, along with other inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.